And sorry. Okay. Can I now? Is this okay? Okay. So a third time. Hi, everybody, and welcome to this panel, Climate Change and Security in the Mediterranean Region. I want to welcome all of you, people who are here, people who are listening to us and streaming, because what we are talking about today in this panel, and we're going to discuss in a layered, with layered keynote speakers, are topics of our area, the Mediterranean, that can shape our future: climate change and security. These are topics that, according to how we will deal with them and how we shape policies in this direction, will shape our everyday life. So before starting, I want to thank the MEDEC, the Mediterranean Experts on Climate and Environmental Change, who organized this panel. It's a huge network of scientists and experts who are assessing the best and the most updated knowledge on these topics. And of course, they make the work accessible to policymakers, stakeholders, and of course, us, the citizens. And they are supported by Plan Bleu and Union of the Mediterranean. Just a few words again about what we are talking about before giving the floor to our speakers. Because why are these topics so important? Threats to security in the Mediterranean area, how are they related to climate change and to climate risk? And of course, how should we tackle them? From which point of view? Political, economical, social economical, and of course environmental, to understand how conflict and migration can be affected by that. So to start, I think we need to frame the climate emergency and to see how it relates to security. And for this reason, we're gonna hear from Andrea Dessi, who's joining us online. He's a scientific director of the Italian Foreign Policy Program, IAI, and he focuses on the Mediterranean, Middle East, and African area. So welcome, Andrea, and we were waiting to listen to your introduction.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates, it's an enormous pleasure to be here with you, albeit virtually, connecting all the way from Rome, Italy, on the other side of the Mediterranean basin. My thanks, first of all, go as well to the organizers for this panel, and of course also to the broader Mediterranean Pavilion here at the COP27 in Egypt. In particular, I would like to thank, of course, the MEDEC, and in particular Casia Marini and Giulia Grattacaca for their excellent collaboration in setting up this very important panel. And of course, my thanks and salutations go also to the distinguished speakers and panelists on this panel today. It is great to see indeed some familiar faces with whom I've had the pleasure to collaborate and work very closely with over the past year. And I look forward indeed to continuing this collaboration with these distinguished scholars on this very important theme of climate change and security in the broader Mediterranean region. I would like to also bring my thanks to the Union for the Mediterranean, and in particular Ambassador Garmenos Mastroianni, who as well has been a key partner and supporter of the research and activities that we have been carrying out over this past year. Indeed, together with the MEDEC and the Union for Mediterranean, we have, as the New Med Research Network, which is a project that I curate here from the IAI in Italy, we have developed a lot of research and a lot of time and effort into framing, indeed, the relationship, the complex relationship between climate change, the climate emergency, and various security trends in the broader Mediterranean region. We have done this through publications, through Track 2 and Track 1 meetings, and indeed, it is our key effort and our key belief that only through multilateral cooperation can these challenges be adequately addressed in a genuine manner, and therefore also favoring genuine collaboration between all the shores of the Mediterranean basin. Before I begin with my presentation, I do believe that I need to specify that I am in no means a climate scientist. I'm a policy researcher. I focus on security issues in the broader Mediterranean region. And I approach security, however, from a very broad and multidimensional perspective, in the sense that I do not consider security only in the traditional hard security domains of conflict, wars, civil strife, but we approach security on 360 degrees, in the sense that we look at the many social, political, economic, and cultural dimensions of security as well. And this, I think, is important to stress at the beginning, because my first effort at framing the climate security nexus challenges in the Mediterranean is specifically this, in the sense that when we talk about climate and security, we are talking about human security. We're not necessarily talking about hard conflicts or violent war, but we are talking about human security, and therefore the cascading effects that the climate emergency can have and is already actually having on the full spectrum of human livelihoods, of government capabilities, and in particular on the social contract, and therefore on the relationship between the rulers and the ruled, between the government and population. I highlight this first framing exercise of human security specifically because when we think about the cascading effects of the climate emergency, these expand well beyond the hard security domain. Indeed, they specifically touch upon various dimensions of human security and the social contract in itself. So when we think of climate change, and therefore of rising sea levels, of declining precipitation, extreme weather events, wildfires, biodiversity loss, environmental degradation, and food security, it is clear that all of these dimensions touch upon the relationship between governments and the population, on the social contract in itself. It is well known that the scientific community has by now well documented the role that unsustainable industrial techniques or human consumption models have in fueling the climate emergency. I think the research is also quite clear in the sense of the impact that the climate emergency has on the social contract itself. What there is more need to do is to focus on the interlinkages between the climate emergency and human security itself. And it is in this domain that the New Med Research Network is trying to engage various stakeholders, various government and non-governmental organizations, and especially civil society, to really flesh out how the climate emergency impacts, through this cascading effect, human security, and in particular the social contract. Now, I think that having framed the first element of human security, the second element to put on the table in terms of framing exercises, without doubt, a recognition that climate emergency is a threat multiplier. Being a threat multiplier and impacting, again, human security, it is clear that when we approach the Mediterranean region, a region which unfortunately is still prone to significant levels of instability, of internal strife, of conflict, of authoritarianism, of a lack of healthy social contracts, it is clear that these two dimensions, these two framing dimensions, really increase the risks and the worry for the future. The Mediterranean region, we can look back over the past 20 years, has clearly been impacted by significant internal instability trends, and these, I would say, relate more indeed to human security and the social contract compared to the risk or the reoccurrence of conflicts between states, or even of terrorism and migration, or these other hard security concepts which generally are approached to this region. So if we look to the future, and then the future is actually now already here today with us, it is clear that the instabilities and the conflict and the risks that have come from this broader Mediterranean region may pale in comparison to what the future may hold in store if, in fact, the worst outcomes of the climate emergency really materialize and come into being. In this respect, I want to add another layers of framing to the exercise of the link between climate change and security. And this, in this sense, I would add a third frame, in the sense that we know that the Mediterranean is a climate change hotspot. What we also know is that the Mediterranean is one of the least integrated and more conflict-prone regions in the world. So combining these two elements, it is clear that the threat perception is extremely high. It is extremely high for the states and societies of this region, but it is also extremely high for other neighboring regions, because as we have seen in the past, instability in the Mediterranean and the Middle East does not remain within this region, but can easily spill over and impact other regions and other neighboring states and societies. Indeed, the Mediterranean is facing a perfect storm of sorts, because the challenges, the human security, authoritarian, political, social, economic challenges that we have seen mushrooming over the past decade have by no means been resolved, and have actually worsened considerably in the past 10 to 12 years. On top of this, we are seeing the advance of severe weather events. We can think of the wildfires, which have ravished much of the Mediterranean every summer. We can think of desert storms. We can think of rising sea levels, and we can think of significant droughts. And these are especially significant for states and societies which are already struggling with weak social contracts and with a whole number of other socioeconomic challenges, which have also led to significant social strife and revolutions also in the past decade. So if we combine these elements, it is clear that the hard security ramifications of the climate change, combined with the human security ramifications of climate change, really can combine into a perfect storm of sorts, which would be extremely hard, but also extremely expensive to address when we think about international policies, European policies, or regional policies to implement the necessary adaptation or mitigation strategies needed to tackle the climate emergency in the Mediterranean. And this, I would like to end with 3 reflections when reaching to the point of what to do now, how to address these challenges. The 3 reflections have to do, first of all, with unfortunately challenges which make the adaptation of mitigating policies particularly hard for this region. The first challenge is that not only this region is already experiencing significant socioeconomic challenges, but it is also deeply fragmented within itself and also within internal states within this region. This fragmentation makes the adaptation, the implementation of adaptation and mitigation strategies particularly hard because of the legacy of rivalries, of frozen conflicts, but also of foreign interventionism, which create an area of grievances between states and societies and also between various sub-regions within this area. A second important consideration is the lack of regional integration. If we think of mitigation and adaptation techniques needed to address these challenges, only through multilateral collaboration and integration of connectivity between states and societies within this region can efforts really make a difference. However, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, is the most unstable and also the least integrated region in the world, and this creates significant challenges and hardship, I would say, in implementing region-wide approaches that can help to mitigate some of the most adverse effects. Of course, the European Union has outlined a number of policies, and these are absolutely important, and we perhaps can engage with them in the Q&A. But what we really need is increased South-South integration to be able to exchange techniques, to be able to overcome rivalries, to really integrate the region within itself. Finally, I think the last challenge to overcome is that of the lack of awareness still within the Mediterranean, the Middle East. In certain areas, there is a lack of an awareness of the implications of climate change and its cascading effects on security and human security, and therefore there is a need to relaunch public awareness campaigns, but have these really be born from within the region itself and not necessarily brought from the top down. These are long-term challenges. However, we know that the time is not on our side. The climate change, the climate emergency is with us already. There are already significant security challenges emanating from it. And therefore, the more time is wasted, the more time is directed to not really addressing the underlying challenges that prevent integration and cooperation within this region, and the less time we will have to really dedicate to the needed mitigation and adaptation techniques that require a long-term planning, but also, and most importantly, require buy-in by the populations themselves to be effective. Therefore, when we approach climate change in the Mediterranean, we should not forget the older and classical engagement topics or engagement domains. When we think of politics, when we think of human rights, of the rule of law, and of government legitimacy. These are elements that will be key to the success or failure of mitigation and adaptation techniques.
Thank
and in
you.
this respect, we need to really invest more on these roads and these domains. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. We will explore more topics during the Q&A, but thank you for for this overview and also for giving us a list of all the challenges that we have to face in these topics: human security, in a, as you said, like conflict-prone area where we really have to tackle the issue of stability. And so, just to go on in this direction, I would like to welcome Wolfgang Kramer, France coordinator of MEDAC, environmental geographer and global ecologist, because there is one aspect that it's very important when we think of all these topics that we started exploring, which is resilience. What are, Wolfgang, the implication for state and social resilience if we think and tackle of these topics that we are just starting to get to know in a detailed way?
Yes, thank you, Veronica. As far as the question is concerned, I hope that we can come back to that in the discussion later on. What I wanted to do here now is talk to you about the Mediterranean hotspot and why it is really a challenge for the for those resilience issues. Andrea already very eloquently made some of the key points, but let me hammer them a little harder. We are on a warming trend. We are already in the climate crisis, and we've already way above 1.5, actually 2.2 degrees in Europe and also most of the Mediterranean. And expectations for the later part of this century are for the current pathways that we are perhaps between 4 and 5 degrees. So if we talk about resilience, we need to take that into account, that we are really warming and drying faster than the rest of the world. IPCC Working Group 1 has shown this, that that there are only two areas in the world, Western North America and the Mediterranean, where there's high certainty that there is already a significant increase in drought. There's drought increasing elsewhere, and there's lack of data in some areas, but it's really the Mediterranean, Western North America that are the most hit. So how resilient are societies against that? It's a very tough question to ask, but we can start with the question, how resilient are people, and how are they affected? And of course they are affected not by these average temperatures, but they're affected by the temperature extremes, which we have seen quite a lot of them passed in this summer 2022, and we have essentially had a heat wave without precedents all over Europe and also in the Mediterranean, also in the sea, by the way, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And the thing that strikes me most is that, again, if we talk about human lives as an aspect of resilience for communities and societies, and therefore also states, why didn't we talk more about the fact that in France alone we've had 11,000 additional deaths this last summer? This is from the mortality statistics, and of course it's not like in other heat waves that we see people basically die directly of dehydration or something like that, but it's statistically clear that we have this super mortality of human lives lost, not only in France, of course, but also elsewhere, and so clearly resilience would mean that we would organize our society in such a way that these deaths actually never ever happen. And the same is the concern for the wildfires that Andreas also already mentioned. So heat and drought are direct risk factors for societal sustainability, resilience and sustainability. And the other point is, of course, changing sea level. We are at 4 millimeters per year at the moment sea level rise, and we have these what we call low likelihood but high impact scenarios from the IPCC, which take us way beyond the 1.5, maybe 2 meters by the end of the current century. And this is not only causing problems for infrastructure and for cultural heritage, but also and it's driven, by the way, by the processes in Antarctica, but it's causing problems for human livelihoods, most of all in the Nile Delta, very close to where you all are, but also in other river deltas around the Mediterranean. And how we can imagine states and societies to be resilient against the loss of livelihoods at this scale, it is very difficult for me to see. In the IPCC chapter, we produced the summary map, which basically shows us that all around the Mediterranean, there are risk areas, high risk areas under the current scenarios that we need to considerably pay more attention to. And what is new in this year's assessment is that the impacts are seen as compound as they are, from reduced productivity, for example, to increased food prices, to reduce household incomes. I cannot say when a state will fail at this point, or a community, but it is clear that that we are in a situation where climate resilient development is imposed on us by all these risk factors, and we have to choose, like is shown by this symbolic diagram from the IPCC, whether we are on a downward path, which may result in severe disruptions of our systems, or whether we limit emissions to a degree that we are actually in a range where sustainable development is still possible. So that's the climate hotspot situation. I suppose that Silvia Barriente will help us further to understand this from an economic perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, like you just said, the Mediterranean is a climate change hotspot. And this is the reason why I want to expand this topic. Thanks to Rula Majdalani. Thank you for being here with us. She's part of the coordinating team of the MEDEC report on environmental change, conflict and migration, and senior climate advisor at ICARNA. And today she will go deeply into this aspect. Why, in fact, the Mediterranean is this climate change hotspot, and specifically, why is this associated to migration and climate risk? Perfect.
Good evening, colleagues, and thank you for staying on till very late. I know it's been a very eventful day today with the food security, and which is one of the cornerstone of climate change as we know it. It's a pleasure to be with colleagues and the colleagues online. Now, talking about the Mediterranean, there is no doubt is a hotspot. Whatever we look at, whether in terms of temperature increase, it is above the global average. Whether if we look at the seawater rise, it is above the average. In every aspect that we look at it. So the impact of climate change, we know, is bringing a lot of effects in already a water-stressed area, already in a water-stressed region where we know that probably the region has the most, about 60% water poor countries that are below the 1,000 cubic meter of drinking water per annum. So it is a region that is already challenged, and I will not delve into the figures and the science. We know about, as colleagues have already mentioned, the impact of the water stress is impacting agriculture. The sea level rise is affecting not just the availability of water, but the quality of water, the salinity, increased salinity. And having countries that are, especially that most of these countries have been traditionally known for their agriculture around the Mediterranean rim, are clearly affected by receding and deteriorating agricultural outputs, which were already not very productive, but also they provide, maybe if you look at them, they don't go beyond 10% of GDP on average, I'm talking, but they provide livelihood for at least 30 to 40% of rural communities. So it really affects this, the agriculture sector. It affects also the groundwater available with seawater intrusion, and again, it is forcing farmers to either move to the urban area, leave the rural areas, but also, and some of them change their agriculture production pattern. Even grazing land is being overgrazed, overfishing. So we really have a lot of challenges, and as Andrea mentioned, being a region where you don't really have good cooperation, in spite of so many different attempts to build a vision, a strategy for the Mediterranean region. It is a region that is marked by conflict, by a lot of animosity, and that affects resources that are shared. When you have countries that build dams, it affects the downstream countries. So we really have a problem of the climate change, but we also have a problem of mismanagement of the resources and a problem of governance of these resources. And this is where I think I would like to emphasize that maybe we really need to better understand the mix or the interplay between climate change and what is happening in terms of governance and management of these resources. We know, for example, that in Lebanon, in Jordan, we have had an influx of migrants, and that has really maybe highlighted or put in a spotlight the problem of already scarce resources that are affected by climate change. But then again, climate change becomes, and the management of resources become politicized to such an effect that you cannot really manage them in the proper way. Again, I am coming to the case of Lebanon and Jordan in that sense. We have had a history of deteriorating infrastructure, a history of unaccounted for water, knowing that Lebanon is rich in water, Jordan is not. Jordan is one of the most stressed. But still, there is that problem of management, and it is related to bad policies, to bad economic tools, to subsidizing scarce water resources. And then when you have the problem of the migrant population, and the migrant population is very big, and it's almost half of the population of Lebanon and of Jordan, it gets accounted, the lack of access to these, to water, to energy, to food, gets put on the account of either the climate or on the account of the migrants. And this is where I see there is a need to better disentangle that intersection between climate change and the socio-economic and security issues. I think it's not a coincidence that there is increasing emphasis, even though I think the literature, while the literature is well advanced in terms of defining the biophysical impact of climate change as primary and as secondary on the rise in temperature, the heat waves, etc. We've heard them, and they are really readily available, and everyone knows them. Probably the fact that, like Andrea said, that there is, I wouldn't say there is no lack of awareness. It's more of there are, the political takes precedence over this, the push factor, even though it's entrenched in the climate issues, even though it gets amplified by the climate issue. And here I want to come to the question of migration and the displacement. And I think that there is there is a need to better understand that there is a stereotyping of migrants, and we need to discern myth from reality in that sense. For example, accusing migrants that they are taking the jobs, accusing migrants that they are taking the water, the energy. When you look at it on the ground, it's not, they consume much, much less than the wasted water and the wasted energy. So there is a need to discern this and understand it better. There is also a need to see, and from that security point that Andrea mentioned, I wish it was in that sense, but I think that there is from the EU perspective, it's more of looking at security and climate security as more of a defense mechanism, or how do we stall the migration flow to Europe. It's understandable in a sense that when you have such an influx in large number, but also from maybe there is a threat or a misconception that they are going to change the culture of Europe. And this is where we need to put it down and clearly say it. You know, it's be honest about showing that this is what scares Europe, and building a fortress of Europe. This is what comes out in the climate security debate, I think. And so for example, there was a lot of discourse and debate on if refugees from Ukraine are more acceptable than refugees from Syria or Jordan or Iraq. And these are issues that need to be addressed and questions. I'm not putting any value judgment on that, but just highlighting that we really need to, when we say we are looking at the nexus between climate, migration, and conflict, we should be able to untangle and open up these questions for discussion. I think that we need to work for a more, I know it's not for tomorrow to be resolved, the problem of integrating the Mediterranean. It is a disintegrated area. It is high in conflict and challenges. But there is a need to maybe the different regional organizations, the basin organization that are working. There is the UFM, there is the Plan Bleu, there are the three regional commissions of the UN that are working on the Mediterranean area. To what extent can they push? I think when, and with the climate challenge, the fact is that it is getting worse and worse, and there is, countries will have to work together. Countries will need to work together, so we really need to see how you can, on what areas you can bring them to work together. This is one thing. The other thing, we really need to explore more how can multidisciplinary research and development initiative can be looked at that. It's already opening up, but there are still gaps in the socio-economic, in the political side, but it's good that it's opening up in that sense. And the last, okay.
We're running out of time.
Okay. Okay, I'll stop at that and maybe come back.
Maybe we'll come back during the Q&A.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Rula, because many inputs, like for example, cooperation or lack of cooperation, management or mismanagement or resources, and like all the questions that we've been seeing, like through what happened in Ukraine and in other war scenarios, like questions that we've been asking ourselves. I just would like to move a step forward with Silvia Parente David and think of what all we've been like thinking, like climate change and security, but add like the topic of energy. We just spoke about Ukraine. I've been there quite a number of times, and there's been like a huge question, like how can we reduce the dependency of on Russia and create new partnerships? So I want to ask Silvia, who's a senior advisor on energy and climate change, and previously she worked as a senior energy specialist for the World Bank. Are there opportunities for the Mediterranean area? Like what are like the challenges if we think of the factor of energy? Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I will keep my preamble short because I think we're running short of time, but I do want to thank the MEDEC and the UFM for inviting me, and I'm just feeling so sorry that I cannot be there in presence and have to do it virtually. But I'm a Mediterranean passionate, so I will try to do whatever I can to make the Mediterranean integration work. And let me try to share my screen. I think. You're not at the beginning here.
Yep.
Okay. Basically, today I've been asked to talk about energy. And as you said, there have been multiple energy crises that are shaking energy markets around the world, especially Russia-Ukraine one. And they require an acceleration of the energy transition to avoid worsening the climate. When people tend to focus on energy security. Because when I talk about security, it's a little bit different from what Andrea called security, but we can reconcile the two. But the point I'd like to make is that it exacerbates the energy trilemma, which is already difficult when you have divergence between the objective of energy security, sustainability, and affordability. Usually says affordability. I like to think of the economic concept of cost effectiveness. I think they can be made compatible and working. That's why I put arrow in the center, converging as opposed to diverging. That's what you need to achieve. And what I want to show you today is that in the 7 minutes I have, is that this is particularly true in the Mediterranean, which is a very good test place for making a convergence between the three dimensions of the energy trilemma. We talked about Europe briefly, and I'm not going to go into all the details of what Europe is doing, but Europe is already a place with the RE Power EU that is trying to converge between the energy security and reacting to the Ukraine Russia conflict, which has reduced the gas supply. And so instead of finding alternative supplies of gas, then it's a possibility, it's an opportunity to accelerate the renewable scale up, to substitute for the imported Russian gas and the hydrogen accelerator as well. And what's also important in the RE Power EU, and I'm not going to go through all the dimension, but is that it stresses the necessity of working together, a partnership, of course, by putting a platform for buying gas, but also other dimensions, such as, for instance, the new green partnership that was signed recently between the EU and Morocco, and there are other opportunities like that. So the EU is trying to reconcile this international dimension together with the energy security, and that's always obvious. And as I briefly said, it is in the Mediterranean that you can make those different forces work together. This is the area in the world with some of the best resources in renewables, carbon-free energy resources that can be made available to Europe, but also from a Mediterranean country. Moreover, the integration of the European and Mediterranean markets increases the flexibility of power systems. So this is a little bit technical, but that's a prerequisite to scale up renewables because they are intermittent. I think you have all heard that. And the bigger your market, easier is it to balance it because there is always sun someplace and wind someplace. So when you try to balance your supply and demand over a wider area, it's less costly. And this is, as I said, the key highlight of the EU Green Deal and DRE Power Europe is that there's a need for cross-border regional cooperation to be able to exploit these resources to the benefit of everybody at least cost. Now, what do we need to make it happen? And we skip this with the rest of time, which is a similar argument for hydrogen, because hydrogen, I notice, has been everywhere at the COP27. So to make this happen, of course, you need what we call the hardware, the interconnection across the Mediterranean, around the Mediterranean, the LMED, which I think has been discussed during the COP27 between Italy, Sicily, and Tunisia is an example. The gas transport infrastructure as well, which can be repurposed to transport hydrogen or hydrogen natural gas blend. So you need this hardware, but that's not enough because it's not going to work if there is not some interoperability of network, some harmonization of market rules. Some markets can talk to each other. They can communicate. So you need some harmonization, not complete convergence, but some harmonization of market design. That requires also cooperation. This is something I've heard a lot in the few sessions I attended, cooperation partnership. So I'm saying it again, between the transmission system operators, but also between gas and electricity. You need to co-optimize gas and electricity, not separate. You need to move out of silos. And also cooperation of regulators. I always make the comparison when some of you have heard me many times. It's like listening to a good concert. Having good instrument and good musician is not enough if you don't have a good conductor that make it all work together. And I think this is something very important because we're talking about multilateral pathway, and that's where we hit the big difficulty. How do we make it all work together? And in a way, the COP27, that's where we need to discuss these things. As I hear so many times, so many sessions on cooperation and partnerships. However, I think sometimes it's no good to be a partner and cooperate if nobody does anything, because you need at least to have one of the partner being a leader and taking the others together, because having many partners and is no use if nobody does anything. But anyway, this is an opportunity, and that's what's being discussed during COP27 to reconcile climate change objectives. I mean, in my case, I'm talking about climate change mitigation, obviously, because I'm talking about energy and national energy security. They are not necessarily antinomic. They can work together. As I say, we need cooperation, market integration to support affordable and just transition and more rapid decarbonization. Wolfgang told us we need to accelerate. We are getting in a very critical situation, and we can accelerate because we have the resources. So we must make it happen. It is available now, and it is cheaper now thanks to the energy crisis. So the renewables are becoming the most competitive forms of energy. It's also an opportunity for the Mediterranean revival. As I said, there was a Mediterranean passionate, and now is the time. The COP27 is been deemed the Cup of Africa, and the Mediterranean is in between Europe and Africa.
Thank you.
Europe is pulling everybody to carbon neutrality. Africa needs to be taken on board. I've seen there were a few sessions on Med Green Deal. We talk about it, but that's where you could make a Mediterranean Green Deal to push the renewable potential of the South to the benefit of the South and the North, as well as green hydrogen. I think the green partnership between EU and Morocco that was signed just before the COP is a good example showing the way. Now, the title of my talk I was given, and I've worked with Andrea on this question, how do we make it multilateral? I don't know. But the question is how you move from one single deal to something that brings everybody on board. And I will leave it with a question that rather than an answer, I can try to give you answer later. And here are a few resources you can go to if you want to dig a little bit more deeply into the subject. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for sharing all this with us, especially the questions and mostly the opportunity that come from COP27. So we've been focusing on different topics, like from agriculture to security to many challenges. Now it's time to focus mainly on governance, and we will do it with Mohamed Ben Hassi. Thank you for being here, who's like a senior environment expert at ESAC, the Economic and Social Environment Council, and also a professor. So this is our question for you. What kind of policies need now to be implemented in the Mediterranean area, both at a national and a community level, to deal with climate change and security in all the nuances we've been talking about during this panel? Is it working? Yeah.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank the MEDEC staff for inviting me to take part in this event, which is covering a very exciting issue. It's a new and old issue. So it's old because security is a feature of link to the nation states from the beginning. But the security is like a feature that is evolving because the interference between security and many factors can shape the kind of responses that we can provide for to govern security. So within the climate context, the security issues are starting to have different shape, which needs different responses. So all the interventions preceding mine have made the case for the climate security nexus, and my presentation will try to explore some governance options that are more relevant in the Mediterranean context in order to provide some response mechanisms and to avoid negative implications of this nexus. I will just very quickly recall that within the Mediterranean context, especially the southern shore, the linkages between climate change and security is more tangible, more visible than the other part of the Mediterranean. So this is because on the ground, the dynamics start to be more tangible. When we link, for instance, climate change with the water insecurity, with the food insecurity, with environmental insecurity, with extreme events, sea level rise, everything converge to say that insecurity will be the key word of the policy making of tomorrow in these countries. But let me first just highlight an aspect which is more or less missing in our discussion about the climate security nexus, is the link between what is happening in Mediterranean and Africa. We can't disconnect these two regions. So in my opinion, focusing on the security of the Mediterranean in the perspective of climate change is not sufficient, because we're going to focus only on the symptoms instead of addressing the root causes of the nexus. So the second aspect is that currently there is an evolving discourse or narrative about the climate security nexus, which is gaining too much interest in the academic and the expertise areas, and some policy making areas at all levels are start to be attracted by this discourse. But in my opinion, it's more or less dangerous to provide the response mechanisms based on a certain knowledge gap, because so far the discourse is more or less sexy in itself, but it's not supported by empirical evidence to make a response mechanism relevant on all scales. And this is because the link between climate change and security is more contextualized. That means it needs robust and empirical research on the ground in order to depict the realities and to provide response mechanisms. So going on, for instance, speaking about the climate change collective security or national security without going to the ground, in my opinion, would be a mistake to be made, and it will reproduce some policy mistakes already adopted in the past. In the meantime, in terms of governance, we know that in many Mediterranean countries, addressing environmental and climate issues are still being made from or using some traditional approaches like the sectoral approaches. From the country I came Morocco, we have a Ministry of Environment, we have a Ministry of Water, a department dedicated to climate change, foreign ministry or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the defense. But when it comes to the climate security nexus, things are not sectoral, they are cross-cutting. That means in terms of policy making, we have to move towards integrated approaches that can ensure coherent policies. And in this way, the kind of actors to be involved in this kind of policies should be reflected in other ways. For instance, by involving all concerned actors from the citizen to the last decision makers. And given the democracy deficit in the southern Mediterranean countries, where there is more or less a lack of mechanism to involve all actors in an inclusive way, adopting policies regarding climate security nexus will be efficient in itself unless we change the way we practice democracy and also human rights in these countries. So the nexus is also linked to other multi-layered areas. And another aspect linked to the science policy interface, because managing this nexus need the establishment of new or robust frameworks that can facilitate the communication between experts, researchers, and policymakers. So far, it's difficult to provide some very successful or good practices in this regard. MIDEC can be given as an example where there is a good interaction between experts from both shores and also communication between experts and decision makers. But on the national levels, so far, this kind of mechanisms are lacking. The last element of my intervention is regarding the cooperation within the Mediterranean. So far, in my opinion, the cooperation schemes are not adapted with the climate security nexus, because this cooperation are based on traditional approaches where government to government decisions are prioritized, and this gives sometimes space for the politicizing this kind of issues, and also being manipulated by economic interests. We can give, for instance, the Mediterranean cooperation with regard to renewable energy as an example. Right. So far, it's not able. This cooperation is not able to for instance, to use some references like climate justice or inclusiveness, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for mentioning, like, among a long list of topics like climate justice and the importance of implementing policies like looking towards democracy. I think we don't have time for questions, but everything was like so intense and interesting that we have only time for like a final remarks. So I would like to thank Lina To, the Deputy Director of Plan Bleu, for final remarks. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, and thanks to all partners and colleagues who made this event possible today. For those who don't know Plan Bleu so well, it's a regional activity center of the United Nations Environment Programme Mediterranean Action Plan, and we work in the framework of the Barcelona Convention since the 1970s. At Plan Bleu, we study the link between environment and development in the Mediterranean at the interface between science and decision making. At Plan Bleu, we also host the MEDEC Secretariat in Marseille in our offices, and our collaboration aims at improving the science policy dialogue in the Mediterranean. Now, as some of you might know, in 2020, the MEDEC published the first Mediterranean assessment report, presenting the current situation and the future risks related to the impacts of environmental change on the Mediterranean basin. And currently, MEDEC is working on 3 thematic reports that are related to specific challenges in the Mediterranean, and one of them especially focusing on the links between environmental change, conflict, and human migration. So let's keep posted on this one to follow up on today's event. Now, security and climate change is currently also a theme that we at Plan Bleu are looking at as part of a large-scale Mediterranean foresight exercise, which we call Med 2050. This exercise explores possible futures and scenarios of the region by 2050 in a systemic approach, with the ultimate goal of defining transition pathways towards either avoiding what the Mediterraneans consider as unacceptable, or to move towards the desirable. And there is no doubt that in the future, environmental, social, and economic conditions in the region will be very different from today, and most certainly more challenging than today. Andrea Desi referred to the perfect storm just earlier. The Mediterranean is particularly vulnerable because it combines both internal challenges and instabilities and the vulnerability to external shocks, which are linked to the region's dependence on food and energy imports, which we have talked about earlier, and also tourism as one of the major pillars of the Mediterranean Rim economy. The recent history shows just how much the Mediterranean can be impacted by a conflict that takes place outside of the region. During today's event, we have seen that climate and environmental change now come as exacerbators of already existing fragilities in the Mediterranean. And therefore, we can expect that with rising vulnerability, the conflict potential within and between Mediterranean countries will also increase in the future. Now, I don't want to end this event like this, on this dark note, so let me finish, or at least try to finish on a note of hope. Within the Barcelona Convention system, we have been observing that despite a rather tense geopolitical context, dialogue around shared environmental issues remains open and quite active too, whereas this is not necessarily the case in many other sectors. So what if environmental diplomacy and common ecosystem management could also be a lever of action to build trust between countries and foster peace in the Mediterranean region? I'll leave this question to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We'll bring this question and all the other questions home. And I think that we now have been seeing a lot of challenges, and it's pretty obvious and important that we need a systemic approach to tackle them. But our time is over, so I want to thank you all our speakers, both in real life, offline and online, of course, and same for our audience, people who are here, people who have been following us online, and of course, MEDAC to make this possible. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.